So why not talk a little bit about the morality or immorality of suicide? Yes, I think that would be very interesting. So perhaps, as we always do, we could start with a definition, which is not very complicated in this case. It's, I would say, suicide is the deliberate ending of one's own life, either through active or passive means. So there's one way of suicide is to, for example, poison yourself or strangle yourself, like stop the oxygen flow to the brain, or cut your veins or something like that. And the other way is also if you just stop eating or stop drinking, then you will also die after perhaps 5 days at the most, if you don't drink anything. So I would consider that also as suicide. So what would you think of this definition?
Right, yes, that makes sense to define it the way you did. I would also say something like the deliberate termination of one's own life. One can also call it self-murder, because you're committing murder, which is the deliberate killing of a subject, an innocent subject. But the subject in this case is yourself. And yes, that is essentially what suffering is. And yes, that's an interesting point, that if you just refuse to eat or drink over an extended period of time, and then you will eventually die, you would, yes, that would, I suppose, fit into the definition of suicide. It's not, when people hear the word suicide, they perhaps associate it more with active means of termination, like shooting oneself in the head or something else like that. But yes, I agree, it would be also within the definition to deliberately refuse to consume things which are absolutely necessary for your life. Yes, so I think that would be within the definition. And of course, today, most people consider suicide to be immoral, at least in general. And there are some debates about euthanasia, assisted suicide, where people aid certain patients, for instance, in a hospital who struggle with certain diseases, and end their lives, because the idea is that they would rather die a more peaceful or comfortable death than a little more or somewhat more brutal death in the future. That's the argument some are suggesting. So there are debates, and it's a controversial subject. But at least suicide in general, that's considered to be something bad, and that is something one should avoid.
I guess I would agree insofar as how could you say this? It will not be well qualified, but something like, if you still have important things ahead of you in your life, then suicide would be considered a bad thing which you shouldn't do, I think, also in our society. So for example, if you are a teenager and you are just very emotionally down because this person that you have a huge crush on doesn't want to be together with you, then people will say, yes, this is a very bad feeling. You are hurting a lot, but still you should continue your life, because good things will come again. And I think this is kind of the idea. Or also, if you, for example, have young kids, then it would be considered immoral to commit suicide, because then you would leave your kids kind of, how do you say this in English? You would abandon them, and it would be a very bad effect also for them. And so that's, in that case, it's more that you have a responsibility, and you shouldn't flee from this responsibility by just ending your life. I think in that case, I would agree with your point that it's considered a bad thing in our society. Now, if, for example, as you said, you are very old and, for example, you have a very long-lasting but incurable disease, which will just slowly make you weaker and weaker and give you more and more pain until you finally die, then I think some people would still perhaps consider it that you shouldn't then end your life, but this would be more out of some religious conviction. Whereas other people today would say it's understandable and it's okay if you want to end your life under such circumstances.
Right, so that seems to be those opinions which divide people, and I think you also explained well why many oppose suicide in general, leaving the question of euthanasia aside, because I believe that most people would deem it to be very bad by virtue of the effects that suicide would have on other people, like friends and family. Especially if you are a parent and you have children, and if you commit suicide, that would be very what's the right word? That would make the children and wife or husband suffer, because they would they would not have a good and comfortable situation with the person in question committing suicide. So I think most people would agree that doing that in those circumstances is not acceptable. It is an escape from responsibility, you could say, like you pointed out, because you have a responsibility to take care of your children and other persons under whom you have authority and responsibility. And if you just escape that by committing suicide, that's something very bad, as well as it being it leading to suffering for those people who love you and hold you dear. So that seems to be the most of, or many of the reasons why they do, as well as I think you pointed out that there will be good things in the future for that person. So if you have a person who is relatively in a young age, like there have been some people who have committed suicide being teenagers, and that's a very tragic scenario because they have their whole life ahead of them, many people would say, and they just terminate it and leave friends and family behind, so they suffer, as well as not having all those opportunities which people in general have later in life. And that's considered to be a very tragic event, and it is truly tragic. But as you pointed out, with euthanasia, it seems that people are making some people are making an exception, in that if you are truly struggling with a disease and you are old, it could be acceptable, according to some people, to terminate one's life by the aid of someone else, because then I suppose they would say, or many people would say, that friends and family would sort of understand that, or perhaps even believe that that's a more comfortable end for that person's life, instead of dying later in a more uncomfortable way. So I think many people would say that euthanasia is different, because now you don't have the same kind of suffering that people around you will experience, as well as being in a state where you don't have much, you have very little time left to live. So there's not like you have a lot of opportunities that you miss, like in cases with younger persons, you're already at the end of your life, and it doesn't, you don't forgone that many goods when you commit such an act, would people say. However, I would disagree. I believe that euthanasia is wrong, that suicide is always wrong, by virtue of a more fundamental moral principle, and that is that you have a duty toward your own life. It goes back to some of the things we were discussing about antinatalism last time, and the time before that when we discussed the issue, that you have this life, this being that you are supposed to preserve. You are moral creatures. You have the ability to promote virtues, and moral goods, and it is immoral to destroy your own being, and that's the foundation of those moral goods within you. That would be contrary to the purpose of your existence here on earth, at least one of the purposes. So yes, that was some thoughts that I shared.
Yes, these are some good thoughts. I have more than one thing to say to all of them, so I will try to not forget anything. I think the one point that you brought out well is this idea that suicide is bad because it leads to suffering for the people who are close to you in your life. And you could say that since human beings are social animals, then, as you said, your responsibility does not only, it doesn't end with yourself, but it also has to do with the life or the experience of other people around you, because human beings live in groups and they are interconnected. So I think that's an important point. And also, as we touched on in our last conversation about antinatalism, this idea that life is a gift or life is something good in itself, and that you almost have to take this as an axiom, because the fact that you are here and that you are living and that you can think about all of these things depends on this basis that life is actually something good and has kind of a value in itself. And so therefore, if you end your life, let's say prematurely, where you still have a big part of life ahead of you, then you are kind of not honoring this gift, or as you said, you are not, you called it a duty towards preserving your own life, and you are then not doing that. So, and also I think I was also thinking of Aristotle, who said that basically the purpose of a human's life is to have a good life. And what good life means is kind of to a large part based on a person's nature. And this nature in one part is made up of him being a human being. So there are certain things which are good or not good for a human being as a human being. And then there is also a certain potential or a certain function which you as an individual have. So in the religious terminology, the idea is that there is something that you were meant to do in this world, or something that you were meant to bring into this world. And if you end your life before you have done that, then you have kind of not fulfilled this potential that you had. And this seems to be a bad thing, because it's kind of like you are wasting something good. You are wasting this potential. And so these are a couple of thoughts. I will let you say something to that, and then we can continue.
Right. Yes, you made some good and interesting points there. And I would also absolutely agree that human beings have certain potentials which they are supposed to actualize. And that goes back to at least one of the purposes of them existing and living here on Earth. And I would thus say that all human beings, by virtue of their human nature, has an inherent potential to promote certain moral goods and virtues. And those moral goods and virtues, like justice, temperance, love, prudence, etc., are, because they are moral goods, it is good to preserve them and actualize them in your life to the degree that you are able, even if you are prevented from actualizing certain goods, moral goods, at least you have that capacity or potential within your nature, and that is one of the things that makes human beings so valuable and unique. And thus, when you, if a person commits suicide, he contradicts that purpose. He destroys the possibility of actualizing those potentials inherent in his nature, and therefore he is literally, in a philosophical way, missing the point of life in his act of doing that. So yes, I would say that this is a huge reason why suicide is as such an immoral thing.
Yes, I think this is an important point that we have kind of focused in here, that there is, I feel, each person has a certain purpose, or more than, or the purpose can be multidimensional, but there is a certain purpose to life. As you said, there is kind of a potential, as Aristotle said, the first actuality, and you can make this potential be real, so to really then exist in reality. And this is kind of the purpose of life. If you see life as an act, or as something that you do, then the purpose is to actualize this potential which you brought with you. And one part of this potential is, as you said, to love and care for others. And you can still do that even if you are a paraplegic or tetraplegic, or even if you perhaps have an illness which makes you hurt, then you can in principle still be there for others and listen to others and do something good. So you could say, or I think this is one of your arguments, that basically there is always some small good thing that you could do, and if you choose to end your life, then you are choosing not to do this good thing, and therefore this would be bad. Is that a correct summary of your argument?
Yes, I would formulate it that if you commit suicide, you are going away from potentials to moral goodness being actualized. You are preventing yourself from promoting these goods which you should promote. So yes, I think we are thinking of the same idea. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So now I have a couple of interesting questions or objections to this idea, or I think arguments why I think under certain circumstances it is good and actually even moral to end your life. And so one is more just it's more kind of an organizational problem. So in the times when human beings, and also our let's leave that, but just in the past, when human beings lived, like for 99.99% of the time that human beings lived, most people died quite young, and even the ones who got old, they died much sooner than people die today. And this is just because they didn't have such a good control over nature, both outside of their own body, but also through medicine over their own body. So if people had a sickness which was incurable, then they wouldn't have to suffer this sickness very long, because you couldn't really do anything about it, because people didn't have any technology, and so most of these things led to quite rapid decline of the health, and then to the death. And so in that sense, you didn't have to make this choice, because nature in some sense forced it on you that either you are healthy or you are soon dead. And now today with our advanced technology, we can keep people alive for a very long time. But this state in which then they exist for this long time, this is not actually a natural state, but this is kind of an artificial man-made state. And I think modern technology has made it so that people have, in many questions of their life, they have to exercise more self-control now than before. So for example, before you could just eat everything that you could eat all the time because food was always short. And so you didn't get very obese because there wasn't enough food anyways. And so you just ate everything that you found. But today you cannot act in this manner, because then you will get very obese and unhealthy and your life will be miserable. Or also in the past, whenever you didn't have to work, then you could just sit down and rest because you had to work so much that this was not really a problem. But today you have to kind of actively do sports in order to keep your body healthy, because you don't have to move any muscle anytime, because everything is automated, and you can just sit on your computer and do that your whole life. And so many things today require more active decision making on the part of the individual. And I think that the medical technology also makes the same important for the decision, when perhaps do I want to end my life, because technology allows this life to go on for a very long time, actually more than it would naturally be the case. So what do you think of that?
Well, that is a very huge issue to talk about, you could say, because when it comes to life expectancy and longevity in ancient times versus today, those are issues that can be disputed, because yes, you have things like high child mortality, which brings life expectancy down. But I would dispute that old people necessarily would be, or the idea that all old people would be living relatively short lives, because, for instance, the Old Testament would suggest that some people lived very long lives. But we don't necessarily need to go into that issue, because yes, you still had many people who died as small children due to child mortality. So there are such factors. So that those issues can be discussed as a separate topic, I would say. But anyways, yes, today we have medical technology which aid people in living longer that they would have done otherwise, given that they have a specific disease or difficulty they're struggling with. But I don't see any problem with that regarding the issue of the immorality of suicide. Because if you have technology to help a person live longer, that would be considered a good thing, because now you can enhance your life and promote your existence on Earth, and thereby be able to contribute more to society, to contribute more in promoting or manifesting certain virtues, etc. So perhaps I misunderstood the objection that you were posing. So you may, of course, clarify things, but as I understood it, I don't see any problem with that concerning the morality of suicide.
Yes, let me try to pose it again. So let's say, let's talk about morality is not the right word, but kind of is it a good rule of behavior to eat everything that you can eat whenever you have the chance? Now, in the past, like in the Stone Age, this was quite a good rule of behavior because food was short. But now food is abundant, and therefore this rule of behavior is no longer appropriate. And so in kind of in analogy to that, you could say, in the past, it was basically as soon as you started to become unhealthy, then because life was very rough and hard, you died very quickly. And therefore, it was a good norm that you should try to stay alive under all circumstances at all times. Let's just keep it that, though not by all means. This is something we have to discuss later, but at least you should try to preserve your life at all times if you don't have to violate a higher moral principle. But this was in a time where a kind of a small decrease in health led to a quite rapid death, which today, thanks to our modern technology, is no longer the case. So the modern technology not only gives people the potential to do something good for society longer, but it also gives them the potential to live a kind of life which is actually not a natural state for a human being, and to live this kind of life for 40 years, because medicine will just keep you alive that long. So that's why I'm wondering if this moral rule can still be applied in the same way.
So if I understood it correctly, the argument would say that in times many centuries ago, human beings were more vulnerable to dying, and life was more dangerous and you could say scarce, and therefore it was they were encouraged in a sense to hold on or preserve their life in a much stronger way because it was so easy to lose it in a sense. But today it's easy, it's another scenario. We're not that vulnerable and it's not that dangerous, you could say. Is that the premise?
That's half of the premise. So
right,
the other half, or because it was more dangerous in the past, the norm, you should try to stay alive always, was good enough, because it was just because the environment was in that sense very strict, then it was just good enough to say, okay, always walk in this direction. But now there is also the option, as I said, of living a very difficult and perhaps unfulfilling life, or burdensome or suffering for 40 years, because medicine will just keep you alive. And therefore it might be that this new technology, which has made more options in life, also now requires a more differentiated moral principle, which could be something like you should try to stay alive as long as you are healthy and still have a lot of good things ahead of you in life, or a large part of your life, or some essential aspects of life like having children and raising them. But you don't necessarily have to follow the same rule in other circumstances, which in the past didn't even exist.
Right. So yes, according to the argument then, given the idea that in the past life was more dangerous and all that, and today it's different, this principle to preserve your life absolutely is no longer relevant or necessarily binding, because we're no longer in that situation. It's another situation where the principle to preserve your life can be relative, because we are not bound to preserve it as strong as before, because it's not necessary in a sense.
I would say yes. I would say in certain situations which are still similar to the situations in the past, it would still hold that you should preserve your life. So for example, a teenager still shouldn't end their life because they are unhappily in love. But there are now also new situations which didn't exist in the past, And in these situations, the old moral dictum might not be appropriate. We have to discuss that.
Okay. Well, my response to that objection would be that the moral principle to never commit suicide and never harm yourself in a way that would lead to your death deliberately and actively is based on facts about human nature as such, and not contingent on certain historical circumstances, because human beings as such, by virtue of their nature, have this potential to promote moral goods, to become virtuous, and things like that, as we discussed. And that is as true before as it is today. And therefore, the argument I would propose is that the principle to always preserve your life, or at least never commit suicide, is based on that consideration, which is the same yesterday, today, and in the future, because it's based on our human nature, which is what all human beings are.
I think we have both made now our point on this question. I have a very interesting follow-up question which could help to make this more, to flesh it out a little bit more. So the follow-up question is, okay, this that you said, if I would accept this statement, or then the question arises, is it moral to say that you don't want certain life-supporting methods of modern medicine being applied to you? So, for example, if you have an accident, for example, this racing guy, Michael Schumacher, he was skiing and he hit his head on a rock and he was very badly injured and he was in a coma. And so then they put him in hospital and attached all kinds of tubes and machines to his body and kept him alive in the coma. Now you can keep a person alive for a long time in a coma today, and sometimes they wake up again and can continue on living with at least a certain, with consciousness to a certain degree. So would it then be moral to say, no, I don't want these life-supporting methods being applied to me should I ever have such an accident? So I would want to die in that case. Or would you have to say, no, because I can still promote something good, even though I might not be able to ski anymore. So therefore, I would have to support all of these methods being applied to me. So what do you think of that?
Right, so that issue of life support, first it's relevant to say that that's a distinct issue from euthanasia of multiple reasons, which people would immediately recognize. But to that question, I would say that I am not entirely sure what my definitive answer would be about, should you make a decision to refuse life support, or should you rather have a decision to should you always make the decision to have life support as long as you can? I'm not actually entirely sure what the correct answer would be in that circumstance. I would say that when it comes to life support as a general issue, there's a difference between merely not giving someone something which is necessary for the life than to actively harm someone. That perhaps they can be compared to a circumstance which is, it's different, but perhaps there is a similarity which is relevant. Let's say that you are in a building which is on fire and you're a fireman and there are 5 people in there, and you only have the possibility of saving 2 of those 5 people. That's the only number of people you can save. And then you choose 2 of those people and you leave the other 3 behind. You could say that you leave them in their death or their way to death, but you haven't committed a moral crime because you are simply not able to save them. Or no, you are able to save them, but you have to choose someone else because you have to choose someone, and to choose someone is necessarily to choose against someone else. Now, of course, that is a different scenario than life support in various circumstances or according to various factors. But perhaps a certain similarity can be talked about in a sense that it isn't necessarily immoral to draw away life support, which would lead to a person's death. Now, again, I am not entirely sure what my answer would be, but those are at least some thoughts I have on the issue. So yeah.
Yes, I would agree with you that it's something different to not act in a way, for example, to save someone, than to actively act in a way to kill them. So I do see this distinction, though I think from the point of view that we are discussing here, this distinction is actually not valid, because we said suicide is the deliberate acting in a way to bring about one's own death. So if I, for example, stop eating, then this is also a deliberate choice which will lead to me dying eventually. And so if I deliberately sign a piece of paper that I don't want certain medical procedures applied to me, then this will lead to my death in this case. Or if I stop taking a medication, which I have to take so that I stay alive, let's say I have some horrible disease and I have some medication which can suppress the disease but not cure it, and I stop taking the medication, then I will die soon. So I think in that sense, it is still a relevant question in our context. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good point. That it could be said that withdrawing life support is a form of passive means to which would be captured by the definition of suicide as you defined it in the beginning. And even though that is done by someone else when you yourself are unconscious, still, if you make the decision in advance that other people would do that in the future, you could, as you said, you could. It seems to be that you could compare it to having a decision that you will not eat in the future, or perhaps even a more similar scenario, having a contract with another person that will deliberately refuse you any food in the future whatsoever and lock you up in some room and let you starve, but you consent to it and you have this contract with him. Perhaps that's even a better example to make a similarity. Yes, I could go on with sharing some thoughts, or do you want to?
No, go on.
Okay, right. So I suppose then you would therefore have an argument that making a decision in advance that other people should withdraw life support from you is a wrong thing to do. Perhaps the correct answer is to say that this issue is outside of my judgment, that I cannot make that judgment in advance. I'll just see what happens, that you sort of acknowledge that what happens to me then is outside of my control. Perhaps that is the correct answer. Right. So again, I don't have a definitive answer, but that's at least some thoughts that I had right now.
Yes, I think, however, because your argument where you said why it's modern technology doesn't matter for the principle that life should always be preserved was that it's in human nature that human beings have the potential to promote good. And therefore, if you would neglect your own potential to promote good, then you would kind of neglect to make this potential into actuality, and therefore you would not do what your purpose in life is, and therefore it would be bad. Is that correct?
Yes, according to the argument that we talked about earlier, I suppose that would be a correct presentation of it.
Yes, and so then in that sense, if I would in any way say or act or ask that I shouldn't be kept alive by all means possible, then I would also forego my future potential to do something good, and I would do that knowingly and willingly. So therefore, I think I would, if this principle that you have said was absolute, then I would have to agree to all methods of life support being applied to me as long as it's physically possible.
Yes, it is a good point to brought up there. So that might therefore be a reason for why a person making a decision about such a potential future must say that I should intend to have my life preserved in those circumstances. However, if you actually happen to be in such a circumstance, and then other people will then make a decision about what to do with those life supports, they could be in a moral scenario where they would have to choose between giving you life support or giving someone else a similar life support, and they therefore have a different scenario. Again, we see the similarity to the fireman in that house on fire. So you could say that it can be justified perhaps with certain doctors withdrawing life support because they have another scenario, but as for you, your own future and deciding or having intentions about what will happen to you, then you have this principle that you will preserve life. So what do you think of that kind of response?
I think that would be consistent with what you have said before, and it's of course true, as you said, that if, for example, the energy or the medical resources are scarce, then some doctor or some people would have to decide who gets now this treatment because there's not enough of this scarce resource. So that would be a different scenario. I would agree with that.
Right, yes. So I would also point out, though, that might not necessarily be relevant to this specific scenario. It's a general issue that it would still be morally right, I would say, to sometimes let death confront you. For instance, if you, let's say that you is in an extreme scenario where you are stranded on a desert island with a few other people, and there's only a little bit of food left to eat. Perhaps you might be the one willing to commit an act of heroic self-sacrifice and say, you know what, there's not enough food for all of us, so you take it so you'll survive, and I will be willing to die of starvation. That would be considered a heroic, a noble act of self-sacrifice, which would lead you to your death. But here we have this higher moral principle of preserving someone else's life. So I would point out that the principle to preserve one's own life is something that can be consistent with sometimes the means necessary to preserve your own life can be foregone. However, there is still a distinction between doing that and actively destroying your own body, I would say. So I would still make a distinction there. But yes, there are some thoughts that I would point out.
Yes, I think this is a very good point. I wanted to go to this also, so that's great that you brought it up. That we would have to say that sacrificing yourself for a greater good than your own life is not suicide, but it's actually, as you said, a heroic act of self-sacrifice.
Right.
And you made one very good example. This is, for example, in the Inuit culture, so the people who live very high in the northern North Pole. There it used to be in the past that the old people would at some point, when they could no longer feed themselves, they would just stay where they are and not continue to move with the tribe. And so they would freeze to death quite soon. And this was a tragic necessity because of the harsh circumstances, because it was so difficult to live in this climate that the tribe didn't have the energy to help old people who could no longer feed themselves, who could no longer hunt and make a productive contribution to the society. And so this was also, I would put in a similar category to what you said, that someone would be willing to starve so that the others of the group might continue to go on living. So yes, and there are many other examples, like parents who sacrifice themselves to save their children and so on. So I think that's an important point. Yes, now exactly. My question is though, if I am getting very old, like now here in my society, and I see approaching me is now sooner or later I will get some form of sickness, I might get some brain stroke and no longer be even very consciously here. And then I will be a burden on my society. So there will be people who have to take care of me. I will require resources and space, and I will perhaps eat up all of my my savings, which I could give on to my children and grandchildren so that they can increase their own life. Couldn't you then make an argument that it's the same thing in some sense, that it would be a noble act to end my life in that sense, or in that scenario?
No, I would say that when it comes to resources in society that people in general participate in, which also the elderly participate in, and some of them being necessary for their life, I would say that is properly given to those elderly, because the elderly are part of society. And as we have discussed to some extent before, common goods in society exist for the sake of all the subjects or members in that society, and that includes the elderly. So you could say that society, or at least those governing and having responsibility over those issues in society, have a duty to make sure that the elderly are taken care of, at least in some sense. Now, the question of whether that should be a government responsibility or private sector market kind of issue, that is a separate issue, but at least to the extent that someone having responsibility over the elderly being taken care of, them having that responsibility it is the situation it is supposed to be in, because that is what those resources are meant to do, help those elderly. So I wouldn't consider that to be a burden, but rather in nature of those common goods, because the elderly are a member of society. And also you could say that the elderly have now lived a long life and have probably contributed a lot to society because they have worked and done many things over their life. So there is this respect, you could say, or gratitude given to the elderly that is proper to them, because they have now lived a long life, and they deserve a certain kind of good treatment, because now they are elderly and they need help. So that's a form of showing respect for them, having lived a long life and doing many things contributing to society. So yes, I wouldn't consider that to be a problem. I wouldn't consider them to be a burden. And when it comes to the issue of savings, it is true that they could choose whether to consume some of their money themselves or give everything else to their family. But since they have this duty to preserve their own lives and never commit suicide, that question of them using their savings must also be subject to that principle. So that is what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you made many good points here. So one that I like is that you say that the elderly are also a part of the society. So they are not like some separate entity, but they are actually a part of the society. And from that point of view, you could say, yes, then it is also the responsibility of the society to take care of all of its members, including the elderly. And now I would ask to this point, because this is an important question, how much resources or how far does this responsibility go? Because as we have said today, technological means are enormous. So if all people would pay 10% more taxes, or just in a private market setting invest 10% more of their energy into keeping the elderly alive, then they could be, with modern technology, be kept alive for longer than they are today. And if people invested even more of their energy into researching for even better means of keeping old people alive, then they could be kept alive even longer. So who knows, because that's a little bit my point. The average life expectancy in the past, in the Stone Age, was kind of very low. Now let's take away child mortality, but at 45 you were an old woman, and at 60 you were the oldest man in your tribe, and then soon you died. Now today people get to the age of 80 on average, and perhaps if you improve technology they could all get to 100. And so the question is, how much resources then must a society invest into keeping the elderly alive? Because it seems to me that it cannot be just everything which is humanly possible, because there are also other things that a society has to do, like defense and education and school and parks and hundreds of things. So yeah, that's perhaps one important question here.
So yes, I'm thinking of two things I would point out. The first being that perhaps this can also be understood as a clarification to what I said earlier, that I would consider the responsibility of taking care of the elderly to be, at least ordinarily, a responsibility within a specific family, whether it is a nuclear family or, yeah, you could say it must be an extended family, because we're talking about grandparents usually, and it would be the responsibility of their children to take care of them. So we could say that it's, ordinarily speaking, more a family responsibility rather than a societal responsibility. But still, to the extent it would be a societal responsibility, that society would therefore have the duty to take care of them to the extent that it is their proper responsibility. Now, you would still have the question, as you pointed out, well, how much resources should you delegate to them preserving their life or increasing their life expectancy, as opposed to other things? Because resources are not unlimited, you have to choose certain things. And that is true also for families as well as societies. So I would say that that question is something that people with responsibility over those resources, they have to take a decision based on prudence, on what would be good for society as a whole, what would be a proper harmonious balance between all those things. And it is true that it is not a duty to give the elderly all the means possible to live as long as possible, because other things are also important. There are other common goods for society as well, not simply them living as long as they can when they're elderly. And I would also point out that the question of finding potential means to increase their life expectancy in the future, that is not the same as the question of allowing them to commit suicide, because there's a difference between potentially living longer and actually terminating your own life, because the former is something that must where prudence comes in, but the latter is an act of killing, which is wrong in itself. So yes, those would be two answers. And also I could point out that yes, the question of old age in the Middle Ages and before that, that is something that could be discussed about how long would they actually live if we take away child mortality, but we don't need to go into that specific issue right now. Yeah.
Okay, yes. You said the good things there. I think first of all, I would agree that it is actually this question that I posed to you, it was a little bit an unfair question, and I agree with your answer that there is not some moral rule that you can say how much resources should be given to keep the elderly alive or to support them, but that the people with the responsibility over these resources have to make this decision and have to consult their own intuition or their own virtue or their own feeling of justice or goodness and make the right decision. But it's not that one person can give an answer to this question. So I would agree with what you have said there. And I would also agree that it's not the same thing to kill yourself or to no longer being able to support someone, as you said towards the end of what you were saying. But I still feel that I see it kind of as a heroic act, like maybe the last heroic act that you can do in our time now, where you can live very long, is to take the burden of this responsibility away from the others and by doing it yourself, because it's a very hard or horrible decision even to have to decide, okay, can we support our grandfather for another year, or do we have to let him starve to death now because we no longer have the food because our children have to go to university? So that's a horrible decision to make as the head of a family, if you so want. Now, if you, as an old man, while you are still conscious and able, decide that you have now lived long enough and you have had a good life and you have done a lot of good things and perhaps a lot of things you also missed, but still now it is the time to end your life, then, and you do this actively yourself, then you alleviate this burden from other people who would else at some point have to make this decision. And also you will give your own children or grandchildren an easier start into their life because, for example, now there is more resources around so that they can go to university or build a house or a company or whatever. So I still feel like it's in some sense a heroic act, but what do you think to that?
I would say it can be an heroic act if you deliberately decide not to, say, consume this or that means of nourishment in order to make others survive instead of you. But first of all, that it would still be wrong to actively take your own life for that sake, because you're still in that case attacking your own being, and that is wrong in itself. And I would also say that those the case of passively not, say, nourishing yourself for the sake of saving others are only heroic in circumstances where that seem in extreme circumstances, you could say, or appropriate in those circumstances where it is necessary for other people not starving. But if you die of hunger simply to let other people in the family go to university, I would say that would not be an appropriate justification, you could say, for that. Because if I were to have such a decision, if someone in my family were to be an elderly person and you had that scenario, I would never let my own father, for instance, do that in order for my children to go to university. I think most people would say something similar. So I wouldn't say that that going to university is a justification for that. But if it's the case of either that person dying of hunger or other people dying of hunger, then it seems more reasonable to talk about heroic self-sacrifice. Now, there was another thing that I was thinking about saying, but I just forgot it. So perhaps that will come back to me. So yeah, I'll let you respond in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I see your point, and I think it's a good point. And again, also this cannot, in my mind, it's not, the boundary is not just there where it has to do with either I starve or someone else starves. But the question is well put, that if we as a society have enough resources, or we as a family, let's say, I would say, okay, I will now let myself die so that my grandchildren can go on vacation to the beach. That would seem quite, that would not seem like a convincing argument. So the question is, at some point where it's more about luxury goods than about the necessities of life, then it would seem an inappropriate justification. I would agree with you there. Yes, other than that, I don't know. I still feel that it's today very much different than it used to be a long time ago, because again, because of technology changed the environment in which we live. So in the past, the care that an old person typically needed to receive up to the point which they died was getting a little bit of food because they were not very hungry anymore, because their metabolism was slow, and having a warm place to live, and having some clothes, and having some social contact, perhaps with their family or with other people. But today, the medical costs of a person typically increase exponentially with their age. So the older people get, the more very expensive surgeries and procedures do they consume, because parts of their body start breaking down. So for example, someone has a heart attack. In the Stone Age, they would have just died, but now you can make a huge surgery and go and clean their arteries and give them some medication, and they will continue living. And then in 5 years, they will have a spinal disc which breaks, and then they will need another surgery in order so that they will not have excruciating pain in their back. And then another year in the future, they will have a brain stroke, and they will need yet another surgery. And so this amount of resources is very much larger than it used to be in the past. And this is not, I can't say where exactly the boundary is, but still I ask myself, like the life expectancy and the possibility of doing good kind of declines as you get older, and the cost of keeping alive goes up. And so there seems to me a kind of point where it would be reasonable to say, I will no longer continue this life now. And this is a decision that I feel is in the responsibility of each individual to make. So yeah, what do you think to that?
Well, many things can be discussed based on those points. I would say that, well, first, the question of, or the issue of high medical cost for the elderly today, I would suspect that much of it can be attributed to other things than simply the elderly being weak, because there are many who would point out that there are deep problems within the modern healthcare system. Corruption and the ways the medical establishment increase costs unnecessarily to increase their own profits, etc. So those are huge issues in itself, and people say that we could actually do healthcare a lot differently and thereby making costs be far lower. But we don't necessarily need to go into that, because that's a huge topic in itself. So I would say that as you grow older, even though it is true that you will be physically weaker and more dependent on aid from others and more vulnerable to various things, physically speaking, you would still have free will and the capacity to make moral choices. For instance, you can still exercise acts of love and other virtues toward your own family and children, and perhaps other people you know who are elderly, friends and others. You can exercise a form of noble friendship or social bond with those people, which is considered a moral good. So you would still have those moral goods even as you are an elderly person. Now, we could say that some people are struggling with dementia and Alzheimer's and things like that, which severely weakens the mental realm. But still, to the extent that they are conscious and able to deliberate and have a will, they have the capacity for moral goods, and thus their being has this inherent value which they cannot attack, to put it that way. Yes, when it comes to the question of organizing resources to the elderly versus other things, I would say that yes, there are other moral goods to consider as well. For instance, education. Education is also related to important moral goods, which is about raising children to become good, virtuous persons. That is an extremely important thing to consider. I want to say that is even more important than merely preserving life, even though preserving life is a good, of course, as we've been talking about. Other things like moral education is extremely important as well. So there is a natural order or hierarchy between different goods. And the principle of helping people living is one of them, but there are others as well.